Hello there, 2D character animation students. Emily here. I hope you're enjoying Character Animator and the different skill sets we've covered so far. I know things have been very technical so far using this software. We will step back a little bit in the next exercise. Breaking Chad's really just an introduction to what we can do. But obviously to get to that, we have some fundamentals to cover too, not just designing and creating your puppet instead of editing artwork, but things like walk cycles, model sheets, and that's what the rest of the semester is for. So this is just a little intro. You can draw whatever you want. I uploaded the Cat Chad puppet in last week's folder if you want to play with one of my examples. I also uploaded that cat song, which I think I aged it as playing it. I think every time I played it, it became less cool. It might not have even been cool going into that. But today I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the modifications you can make to a puppet using the pins, handles, draggers, whatever you want to call them. Where those tools are in After Effects, because they existed in After Effects first. All of this was kind of just a little part of After Effects before it became its own program. Starting with the puppet tool. Shout out to the puppet tool, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Works very much like the pins in Character Animator. And then a little bit of Illustrator. We've mostly worked with Illustrator. We'll work with Photoshop throughout the semester too, not just for creating artwork, but cleaning up model sheets and sketches and things like that. But I added a little bit to my Medusa puppet here, mostly with the snakes. And with the snakes, I started with that original design. And I made it part of the face background like the rest of it. And if I go into the rig mode and click on the background, some of these, you can see we've got that grid going through here. Some of them already have a little pin there, but just in review, to place a pin, we have these tools along the bottom here. Very few tools within Character Animator. It's really for animating and rigging and performance capture versus creating. But we have these handles, and everything to the right is just a variation of this primary handle tool. It's just that the modifiers over here are already applied. So dangle, for example, is just a regular handle. It's just that it has the dangle property applied to it. So if it seems confusing to you, just stick with that first handle tool and then modify the modifiers afterwards. Choose the modifier afterwards that best suits what you're looking for. So if you want things to just kind of hang and move based on physics, you should do dangle. That's going to make them susceptible to gravity within the piece, which we can adjust in the record mode. If you want to be able to move that object, then you would want to make it a dragger. So you just have to kind of hover your cursor over these, or like I said, use the basic one and then just modify it. So if you want it to be draggable, you would choose that. Probably the least exciting handle, but one of the most useful, which is a fixed point. A fixed point does not move at all and is not susceptible to gravity or dragging. So I want to have her selected, and I can click on my pin tool, which just looks like a little push pin, and I'm just gonna pin her in the middle of the forehead and see if that helps. Alright, now she's not sinking, but she's upside down. So I've changed the rotation here, and you can see that I changed it not only from her being all topsy-turvy, but anything that's been modified within these properties has a little X next to it. And you could reset that property just by clicking on the X. That'll bring it back to where it was. So I've not experienced that before, but there's always something new with these software programs, which is one of the reasons that they're fun. But I had a lot of dangle points, and apparently the combination of that and not having a fixed point caused the head to sink right off the screen, which was hilarious, but not the result we were looking for. And then you could see that my little dragger one here, I can click and drag to move. But without any fixed points or anything preventing the movement from moving on, you could see that it's actually affecting the side of the face and everything else as well. It's like when your grandma comes in with that cheek pinch. Like, oh, aren't you a cute little Medusa? Aw. So to fix that, I would also go into rig mode. And instead of that fixed point I put right in the middle of her head, I'm also going to put a fixed point right along the side of the ear here. Now I have the mesh turned on, which is this little icon down here. And that will show you the distortion mesh, essentially, of what's being affected and how. So when I place a point, if I delete that, you could see it adds that much more detail to the mesh. It's causing that much more resistance right there because there's that much more data. So now when I drag something, it won't affect things past that point, at least not as much. So if I go back to record, that should reset. And then when I drag this, still distorting, but I can't like pull the whole half of the cheek off like I did. So to cause less distortion, I would just have more fixed points or reduce the power of the draggers in the record mode. So I could place more fixed points here. That places more of a wireframe. And I'm going to go back to record. I'm just testing. This is super common in this process. Now you can see it's really just affecting her ear. But that's also because this is all one layer. The best way to prevent this mesh distortion is to have things on different layers. If it's on a separate layer, just that thing will have the mesh applied to it. I also have some dangle here. We already saw the dangle and what it can do if the gravity is too high up. But I can go here and change my gravity strength. And if there's a lot of dangle points with no fixed points, this is what will happen. So you can see even with this side, the fixed point is really which is the most secure. Okay, so I can go into physics and change the strength of that. Obviously that has a lot to do with it. Or if I go to the dangle itself, I can change how squishy it is and how much less structure it has, which depending on the puppet, that could be totally what we're looking for. Not a right or wrong here, just options. I'm going to X that to go back to what it was. But if I go back into my rig mode, I could just use the fixed pin tool and go along and place more definition along the side of the face here. If I was to increase the gravity now, you wouldn't see that it would affect as much of the face as before. So having those fixed points helps you determine where a distortion should stop. If you don't want to go around a shape repeatedly with the fix tool, that's where the stick comes in. So the stick tool is right next to the pin tool. This is just a pin tool, by the way. You could see pin is just a modifier with fix applied. And a stick is just a fixed point that's a line. I showed it to you with Bongo's arms. It's often used for limbs or to keep something have some kind of structure to it. So I could delete these points just by highlighting them and deleting them. And if I want this whole shape here, this whole jawline to stay put, I could just grab the stick tool and then click and drag. And then everything along there is going to be fixed. If it's not set to fixed, you could see it has modifiers as well. So if we go to record and up our gravity or change our draggers, you could see it works just like having a whole bunch of points. So whatever your preference is with that. But now I have these different points, and then I also have some of my dragger ones. When somebody's starting a new puppet and they import it into Character Animator, they often get kind of a floating head. And I know that's what we want in Breaking Chad, but most of the time that's not the outcome you want. So when you have a character that has a body, like Cat Chad here, Cat Chad, I had added just this really dorky trunk within Illustrator. I could tell from the fur pattern that this is actually his head just reversed and stretched out a little bit, so his torso is just his head shape. But when you add a body into the mix, it's just another subfolder. Your character name is always the main folder, and then within that layer is head and body. Right now we just have head normally with Chad. But I just added a little body tag here. Body tag sounds really sinister, but it really is a term within Character Animator. And this body is just this separate part. So they're both part of the same puppet. If they weren't within this one layer folder, they would be totally individual from each other. So they're all within this one structure, and then that structure has a bunch of sub-layers within it. So the head is already the most complicated, especially just because of the mouth shape. The body in this case is just a torso, which is fine, but it's a separate thing. And so right now it's floating. It's kind of cute, but we really want that lower body to stay put. Now what you have selected here matters. I have the body layer selected. I'm actually going to click on fur. Body is really just kind of the folder. The fur is the layer I'm affecting here. So I'm going to make sure that layer is selected, and then with my stick tool, just so I don't have to go in and place a bunch of different points, I'm just going to drag the stick. We want it to be set to fixed, and if it's not on the right layer of part of the hierarchy, it just won't work. So if we go to record mode, now we can see maybe works a little too well. The reason it's doing this is actually because I have a fixed point in his nose, and it gives it this kind of faux 3D look that I'm not going for. But if you are working with your puppet, I always recommend doing a little warm-up before recording or animating, whether it's dragging or mouse-based or performance-based, making sure everything works properly, doing some puppet stretches basically. And we can see our nose here is really strange. So in rig mode, I'm going to click on the face background. You can see face background by the number to the right of it has 18 individual points. So that number, you can see there's a little point column here. There's 18 handles in just the face. So there's our culprit, the fixed one right in the center. I'm going to delete that. And then when I go back into record mode, you can see he's got a nice kumbaya kind of movement going on. And we can zoom out a little bit here. And if you find that just your whole puppet is too large, you always have the transform drop down, and I would just change the overall scale. And you know, if I wanted to like give the illusion that he's not just a limbless nugget, I might want to move his position down a little bit along the Y as well. So just pre-recording, we would just make sure everything's kind of where we want it to be. So I already had talked a little bit about performing in the previous class. You could do it in different kind of sections and waves. Anything that's armed with the red record button will record in that pass. Anything that's not, that won't. So you could essentially do multiple passes for performance and just record the lip sync or the head movement or the draggers, or all at once, depending on what is armed for animation. We're going to talk a lot more about animation, obviously, throughout the class. I wanted to keep today shorter, and I'd love for you to finish up your Breaking Chad projects and explore those if you haven't yet. There is a place on the discussion board to share those. The main reason I'd like you to turn that in is not just to practice, but because we have another exercise coming up in the next few weeks that involves walk cycles and full body rigs. And so it's just helpful to do the current exercise because then you can focus on the next one as well. So another thing I wanted to talk about today was just a little bit of animation within After Effects. I know I've talked mostly about Character Animator, but then also just kind of going back on the topics of creation. So you could see I took my Medusa to the salon here by adding some more snakes, and I do plan on adding to her throughout the semester. I want to make the snakes more detailed and animate them separately as well, but to get the full body of hair that she has, I actually created a brush based on a snake, and then I was able to just go in with my brush tool and be like, I want hair there, and hair there, and hair there, which was more fun than it should have been. So I really just started with the blob tool like I did before, and I added to that. So I had my blob brush, I painted my snake shape, I made it the colors I chose. Obviously, I'm not drawing a snake right here, it's just a zigzag. I showed you simplifying a path before, and that's a great technique. However, it might take away more of the fidelity than you were looking for. There's a whole host of painting tools within Illustrator, and I'm trying to do ones that are the most user-friendly, just because obviously drawing with the pen tool itself can be kind of labor-intensive. I feel like Illustrator can be harder to use because of the pen tool, but using vectors is always a good idea just for editability. You're never going to have any quality loss with them or anything like that. They're also non-destructive. So I think it's worth the time, but obviously if you're going for a different style, Photoshop is wonderful as well. But if you don't want to just simplify the entire path by going Object, Path, Simplify, which I've done previously, and it's kind of hard to even see what it's doing. Instead, if you go in with these different brush tools, there's a smooth tool. And so if we use our black arrow tool, selects the whole shape and lets us change the scale and rotation of that. The white arrow or direct select tool lets us go in and modify individual points. And we can see how many there are, and if there's too many, we can go in with our pen tool and subtract and add more. But this smoothing tool is really nice because when you have a path selected, you can go in and just remove what's in that spot. So you can kind of just go in and fine tune a shape. This one was already pretty smooth to begin with. But when you paint with something like a brush tool and there's lots of different points like there are right here, you can see those little dots. Let's make this not black. Though that, I made an abstract earthworm just like that. See, art is easy. If I go to the smooth tool and just kind of run it along that area, you can see it removes unnecessary points. And this is way easier than trying to use the pen tool and subtracting points, which is going to greatly change the direction of your path since the points themselves are determining them. So just another little shortcut. Regardless of what you draw or how you draw it, you can make a brush based on it. So I drew my little snake, I copied the pupil from Medusa onto this, and to make a brush out of it, I just went to my brush palette. I think I accidentally stumbled on this in a different class, though I deleted this. I accidentally used this awful tribal brush tattoo. It reminds you of like an armband tattoo at like a old bar, which is fine. I'm a big fan of tattoos in general, but this one, when you're not expecting it, is interesting. So there's all kinds of brushes within Illustrator that you can use. There's a brush library, so there's like calligraphic and drawing ones, but then there's like symbol brushes and decorative brushes. And I usually like to make my own, so it could even just be like a really basic pattern. For some reason, if you wanted that to be a brush, you could just select the item, and then in the brush panel, click on the little new brush icon, and then you could choose what kind of brush it is. Now, you might not know the difference between these, and that's fine. You can actually change the type at any time. But if you want the artwork to stay relatively the same, like with the snake, I did a art brush. But then it gives you the options. Do you want it to scale? Do you want it to stretch? Which direction do you want it to go? I'm just going to click OK. You can see it's added to the brush palette. And then if I just go to a standard brush tool, now I'm painting with those beautiful rectangles. And it's cool though because you can go in and change what kind of brush it is, like I said. So like if I select this, I have my brush panel over here. I can just double click on this to edit it, And what if I want this to be to scale proportionally instead? Or stretch between guides? I can choose these different things about the brush and like which way does it flip. That's going to edit all the instances I should add. Just a useful thing to know how to do. It might not come up in your particular project, but the brush tool has actually been helpful for me more than once. But I drew my little snake, I clicked on the new brush icon, I created a new art brush, and I actually made one facing one way and one facing the other for both sides of her hair. That's what these two are. I wanted them to scale proportionally, since I had the proportions already. And then with that selected, I had my brush tool and I just added snakes that way. Now, because it's a brush, you can get, too out of control and totally distort the object. But I thought this was actually a pretty perfect use of it, just because I was copying and pasting these snakes earlier and was like, wait a minute. I haven't used the brush tool in a while, so this worked pretty well for creating a lot of wavy snakes. Now this is just a stroke. If you click on it, you could just see there's a single path going through this. So editing it is even easier. Rather than having to go in and edit all these individual points and stuff, I'm just going in and editing that path. It helps if the snake itself doesn't look like it was squashed in a horrible accident, but I could even that out a little bit. But it's just kind of fun to play with, even if you use kind of abstract shapes as well. So just another tool that's available to you, at least within Illustrator. And so that snake I made into a brush and had used in Chadusa using my brush tool, just on that background face layer. And I just kind of merged that with everything else. If I wanted these snakes to be, now you can see the difference between the ones that are brush strokes, because they're just one clean little path going through that I can easily adjust, or the ones I did in the previous class that are all separate pieces still. And you can see how much space they take up in my layer palette, because every mouth line, eye circle, and path is a separate thing. So that's a little much, but I created this kind of hastily. I might want to go through and just group these things. I'll probably go in and just replace all of these snakes with the paintbrush ones. For now, I thought this worked. I adjusted her toupee. That's what I call this piece that covers up that unsightly hairline. And I kind of angled her eyes. I made her fangs a little bit bigger, so nothing too crazy, but essentially I mostly had made that snake brush and then added hair. Now I also exported the snake. I just saved it as a separate Illustrator file. You could also export it as a ping or something else. I mentioned in the previous class, we're using a template that has quite a few layers in it, but really anything could be made into a puppet. It doesn't have to have these various parts. So I think that's the best use of Character Animator just because of the performance capture. But if we wanted to, now I made a change, and because I changed the background layer, I sensed that was going to happen. It shifted the orientation of everything else. This happened before, and if this happens, don't panic. It probably won't, because I just changed the scale of my background by adding the snakes, which threw off the orientation. Rather than moving everything else, I really just have to click on Face Background, make sure my Move tool is selected, and I'm just going to move that back into position. I don't need to move everything else. I could bring in that snake just into here. I think I'll do that first, actually. Let me just import my snake AI. I know I saved it to this folder. Alright, so this puppet, remember anything you import into Character Animator is just going to call itself a puppet, whether it's a background or prop or something else. I'm going to put this just right in the composition. You could have multiple puppets in a scene. You could just only operate one at a time. It looks like she has a blindfold on, which is fine. I'm actually going to hide her layer for now. And because this doesn't have any rigging or anything. It's obviously not tracking my face. It doesn't have any animation pre-built into it. If we look at the rig mode, it's just one little layer. The two ways we can animate this in Character Animator are essentially the two ways that we could animate it in After Effects. Character Animator's biggest benefit is the performance capture and the lip sync. But moving, transformation, like scale, rotation, those are all things that other animation programs can do. And then working with handles is actually, I'm going to move it here, but that it can also do that in After Effects. I'm going to show that today too. This little stopwatch next to each property allows you to toggle the ability to add that property on and off. So if I click next to position, that's going to drop a keyframe, just this little diamond icon. And with any type of animation, whether traditional or digital, you need to have at least two keyframes. The thing it's at and the thing it's moving to. So this is recording the position at that point in time. I need to move forward with the playhead and just make a difference to that property. So I'm just going to scrub this that way. And he was kind of centered, so it's not very dramatic, but if I play that back, we have the slowest slide from left to right ever. To edit a keyframe, you have to be on the keyframe, not just with it selected, but the playhead has to be going through it. It's weird, but that's how most programs work. The time's really indicated by the playhead, not what you have selected. If you wanted to copy and paste a keyframe, that would matter. But for editing, I'm just going to slide this guy more over, which is going to edit the keyframe I'm on. And now if I play that back, you can see we have him moving left to right. But it's not really any other kind of movement. That's more like how you'd animate a logo, not a character. So instead of just a left to right movement, which is fine, that's essentially what we do for walk cycles, but walk cycles is left to right with those legs moving. So if we had some movement in the body, that left to right would be more viable. So if I go to rig mode, this is definitely a job for handles. This little origin point, by the way, is just kind of the anchor point of the object. It's where it would rotate from and things like that. So I'm just going to leave that right in the center. I want to add 2 points. So I'm going to use this one right here, and I'm going to put a dragging point at the head and a point at the tail. If I make one handle fixed, I basically just get this cool accordion motion where I can animate it moving back and forth, but I could at least get like some kind of accordion movement here. This would be animating just the dragger itself, so I would disarm everything else. And just at the beginning, I'd probably want to do this before I even animate the left to right movement, just because I'm going to have a hard time seeing exactly what he's doing. If I record from here, oh no, there's a traffic jam. Now you can see if I play that back. Oh god, and I had audio still recording, so that's what those waveforms are. Whoops, sorry snake. But now you can see that great dragger movement in there. This would have been easier to do, like I said, if I didn't already have the left to right, which is really easy to get rid of. If you don't want to animate something and you were just experimenting, on that property, if you just click the stopwatch again, that's a toggle. So it will just undo the existing keyframes. That's one of the most common mistakes when editing and animating with these programs for the first time is people think I click the stopwatch to add a keyframe. You're really just using it as a toggle to say whether this layer is animated or not. The keyframes are added by moving somewhere else on the timeline and making a change to that property. Now, like I said, this isn't what I feel like Character Animator's best suited for, because it's a really simple character that doesn't have a lot of moving parts. So for something like this, I would actually go into After Effects. And you can see I already have a very sophisticated example here. So this is done very much the same way. After Effects, like I said, is a predecessor to Character Animator. Character Animator used to have a little section right up here because it was a drop-down menu. And I imported my little snake AI file. This could be exported as a PNG or a GIF as well. You wouldn't want to use a JPEG just because it would have a white border around it or a box around it. So I'm just going to drag this to the new composition button, just like I would in Character Animator for a new scene. The background color doesn't matter. The background's not even there. Dun dun dun. But I have this object, and moving this left to right, I can just drag it. Unless there's a dragger in Character Animator, you really can't do that, which is weird, but that's because it's performance-based. If I twirl down my properties here, every layer in After Effects has these 5 things that you can animate without adding anything. And there's a lot of twirling down in this program. We kind of saw that already with Character Animator. Like when you're in the rig mode and you're in a puppet that's not just a line, there's quite a few turn downs in here. There's layers upon layers upon layers. And this is a pretty simple puppet in comparison to others. So when you're in After Effects, there's also quite a few twirl downs. And these are just the different properties that everything has, everything visible I should say, whether it's video or an animation or just a graphic. And the anchor point is just where something changes from. That's like the origin point in Character Animator. So if I rotate, it's going to rotate from where that anchor point is. If I move that anchor point, which you can do by scrubbing the numbers, so X is always the first one, Y is always the second, X and Y, kind of scrub this into position. Then if I was to rotate it, you could see it rotates from that point. So the anchor point is just where something changes from. If I was to scale this, it would scale towards the anchor point. So it's not something we normally animate. I'm just going to undo to put it back into the metal again. But it's definitely something you want to be aware of when you're animating. We can move that by scrubbing. There's also a pan behind tool up here that you can just click on and drag it. All the other ones are pretty self-explanatory. You've got position along the X and Y. You've got scale, which is currently linked together, but you can unlink it by clicking on that little constrain proportions icon. That's already separate in Character Animator because I do it pretty much every time I rescale something. As I choose just either or rather than both. Rotation. The first one is number of revolutions, so you're not going to see anything with that unless it's animated. But the second one is just number of degrees. And then the last one is opacity. The best shortcut I can give you in After Effects is the different parts of animation. It can be a lot to twirl this down for multiple layers to get to these core properties. So if you remember the parts of animation, P brings up position, A brings up anchor point, R brings up rotation, T brings up opacity, thanks Adobe, and S brings up scale. So if you're trying to animate quickly and you just want to see one of these properties, you can click on one of those shortcuts. If you want more than one property, you can just throw a shift in there. So if I do Shift R, I'll add rotation to that. Otherwise, like I said, just twirl everything down. It's all under transform. So if I wanted to animate this moving left to right, very similar to what I just did in Character Animator, I'm going to move this off the stage. Anything off of the stage isn't visible, won't render. I'm going to click on my stopwatch for position. I'm going to move my playhead forward. So that moment of time is recorded in that keyframe. And I just need to make a change somewhere else in the timeline to add another keyframe. And the computer is going to tween between those. Traditional animation, we would have to be animating every single frame by hand. I'm just paging up and down to go through these. with computers, it does the tweening for us. We just have to set the specific movements, the different keyframes, and then it's going to tween between those things. Tweeners was a job position early on. The keyframe people were the ones that drew like the important gestures, and then the tweeners, which has got to be the greatest job title in history, they were the ones that drew all these in-betweens. But with us, the software is tweening. We're just setting the keyframes. Whew! And you can see that is really fast. So all we have to do to slow that down is just spread the keyframes out. And then when we play that back, I'm just hitting the space bar. Not as bad. Now, I animated that, and I wanted to talk about the puppet tool, so I'm actually going to delete that animation for now. I'm just going to click on the stopwatch to remove it all. And actually, I'm just going to reset all the transformation properties. I can do that by just clicking on transform, and then reset is to the right of that. Totally non-destructive, just like Character Animator. So within After Effects, the very last tool up here is the Puppet Position Pin tool. I just call it the pin tool. We're close like that. And if you click and hold on it, you can see very close relatives to the pins within Character Animator. So Puppet Position is just kind of the default one. You could see it adds a mesh. And when you add any kind of effect, so there's some basic parts within After Effects. The Project Window tab is where we see all of the assets we've imported and the individual compositions we've created. We have an Effects tab right here, which you don't see unless you have an effect added. So now you can see that the puppet effect is added to this. The composition window is what renders. And then the timeline down below is how we control all of the animation with different modifiers to the right. As the name suggests, there are a lot of effects within After Effects. There's the drop-down menu over here, but maybe even more useful is there is a search bar. That's how many effects there are in this program. So if you're trying to find something and can't think of where it is, you can just type it in and look it up, and that's what this is for. But we will all in due time. So because I used the puppet pin tool, you could see that now it added an effects category, and then within that a puppet category, and now there's all these different things we can modify. I am not going to worry about any of the settings here right now. I just want 2 pins. I need at least 2 in order to get any kind of squishing movement. So I'm going to click over here as well. And then you don't need any kind of additional point within After Effects. Just these 2 should do it. But then you can get this nice movement here. It's almost more like an earthworm. But it works for me, so I'm alright with that. And so we can just kind of move this along. So the default tool, not confusing at all, but the Puppet Position tool looks like a push pin, which is what the fix pin looks like in Character Animator. Any of these things can be modified. Puppet Start is kind of like the fixed tool. If there was something that was distorting too much and you didn't want to, you could starch it. And that just means that when you're bending that other thing, that's not going to distort as much. There's also the Puppet Bend tool. This is not in Character Animator. This is a little bit weird. This is kind of like the Breathe modifier. If you wanted to tangle a snake, this is a great tool. But the Breathe modifier in Character Animator is a property you can animate to make it look like a appendage is moving like this. So I feel like this is After Effects' version of that, that you can animate. Any one of these puppet pins, by the way, are going to have the animation properties down below them. So you can see we have a considerable amount of drop-down items over here now. And so I could animate that over time if I wanted, just by moving forward and making a change, and then you'll see that that just Now he's got like a mouse in there struggling to get out. That's what I'm just going to pretend it is. Like, maybe he's just like, nah. Just constricting back down on it. Oh, there we go. That was terrifying. And then just to slow something down, you could just kind of spread it out some more. There's the advanced pin tool, which is really just a combination of all of the other ones. You can rotate it. You can change the scale. If you look at the properties next to it, you can see the advanced one just has position, scale, and rotation, where the other one just had scale and rotation, where the fixed and dragger ones just had what they are. So depending on the puppet pin type, it's going to give you more or less properties, but you can also see that you can change this at any time. So very malleable, very easy to change as far as you can find these drop-down things. I'd say of this technique, the hardest thing is the navigation, especially if you haven't used After Effects before. But you can see just this one layer. You could twirl that up and collapse it, and it's all nice and clean. But when you collapse that, you've got effects and transform. Transform is where those parts of animation are. And another just key thing about After Effects is you can't edit something unless you can select it. So if I want to edit a keyframe, I have to be able to see and work with that keyframe. These are actually just previews. I can't click or do anything to these. To get to the keyframes, I'd have to twirl down the properties where they are. A shortcut here is just the letter U on the keyboard. U will just show you the keyframes that are already in a layer so that you can go in and navigate through that. So if you remember the parts of animation, and then I think of, hey U, show me your keyframes. Some kind of threat against a layer somehow works, but it's easier than having to twirl down and go keyframe hunting. And then I mentioned it doesn't matter if the keyframe's highlighted unless you're just moving it or copying it. To really edit it, you have to have the playhead going through it. And it does kind of snap. You know, it's going through frame by frame. You can zoom in on the timeline with this little slider down here. But another great shortcut is if you click U to show your keyframes, you can navigate between them using J and K on your keyboard. So you can kind of just jump between those keyframes, and then I could be like, you know, that was a little too bloated. It was a smaller mouse than that. And then if I want that to happen again, I could just copy this keyframe by highlighting it, going Command C. I'm going to move after that point and paste it, so now that'll happen again. But especially when we do walk cycles and things like that, we're definitely going to be using copy and paste. Copy and paste is a time-honored shortcut across multiple industries. So I have this super basic animation now that I can work with. I have some movement with the snake. I might want to get some more tail movement in there. I could just kind of go through and choose where I want it. It's really easy to get around time-wise. You can see that kind of movement there. And if I just want to look at that part of it, most of my animation's happening over here. Character Animator and After Effects both have just a work area that's along the top of the timeline. In After Effects, it's got these little blue handles, and it's just going to play that part of it when I ram preview. So it's not real time till that little green bar is filled in along the timeline. But now you can see it's just kind of looping the playback of the animation, and we can go in and make adjustments and play it again and try it from there. So Character Animator also has that work area in the record mode. It's not as clear, but it's just this gray bar along the top. So if you drag from right off the screen where it says frames, right above there, you can determine the work area. And then when you play it back, it will just play back that little bit. So if we just want to play back that horrible scrunchy part, this is the indigestion he had after eating the mouse. So I'm just telling a narrative here, really. And so work areas are nice, especially if you have a computer with slower RAM or processing. You can just kind of choose that one bit, and then in both programs you can also trim it to the work area. So there's a lot of ways of trimming a timeline, but if I just want that little bit, I could say trim it to that, and now that's the entire length of the animation. Same thing in After Effects. If I go to composition, I can choose to trim comp to work area. And now it's just that little bit I animated, and I could play that for all time. So really basic handle animation here. I haven't even talked about exporting this because we're not necessarily exporting from After Effects yet, but it really wouldn't be that different. You would just do File, Export, and send it to the media encoder. You can also do the render queue right within After Effects, which is like a mini media encoder. And you would essentially just choose where it's going in its name and clicking render. Makes a delightful dinging sound that I'm not sure if you could hear, but it was very loud in my headphones. And then that MOV I could include in a project wherever I need it to be. I usually render lossless, which is a large file, but then when I upload it to something like YouTube, it naturally is compressed, so I tend to like to render at a higher resolution. But we have multiple lectures and classes that focus almost entirely on rendering. And we've already talked about rendering from Character Animator, which is really what matters at this moment. Now I'm really tempted to just lower the snake so that it's like kind of more of a mustache. You know, she is called Chadusa. I don't know how things were in ancient Greece. Like, I'm not here to judge. Like, just kind of shrink that down and position it over, and there we go. I've not seen this rendition before, so I think we are onto something. And with that, I will end today's lecture, but please don't be afraid to email me with any questions. Your main directive for the Breaking Chad project is to have fun with it and just experiment with some of these techniques. And then next week we'll start talking about body rigging and walk cycles and using sticks in something more than just making a torso keeping from floating through space. So I hope to see you join me then. Stay tuned.